Hello, I'm Lanhee Chen, fellow at the Hoover Institution at Stanford University, and I'm pleased to be joined today by Mitt Romney, United States Senator for Utah. Thanks for joining us, Senator Romney.
Thanks, Lanhee. Good to see you.
Good to be with you. I want to start by asking about something that goes back to actually your campaign in 2012, when you talked about Russia as America's number one geopolitical adversary. Fast forward a few years, you give your maiden speech to the United States Senate last year, and you say China is poised to take over that dubious title. Do you think China is there now? Has China taken over as America's number one geopolitical adversary?
Yeah, I think we have to look at the reality, which is China's GDP is obviously much, much greater than that of Russia. At the same time, China has made enormous strides, not only economically, but geopolitically and militarily. They're flexing their muscle in Hong Kong. They're flexing their muscles in the region with the Philippines, with the Solomon Islands. They're more and more hostile domestically with regards to the Uyghurs and other minorities and religions. So, yeah, they're taking on a role not as provocative visually as perhaps Russia from day to day, but without question, they are the geopolitical adversary, competitor, hopefully not threat, but they're the geopolitical adversary that we're going to face over the coming century.
Do you think that some of what's happened with the coronavirus pandemic over these last several months, how do you think that's made things worse, or do you think it's made things worse?
Well, certainly it's made things worse for a lot of people and terrible for the economy and terrible for the public health of the world and our own nation. Geopolitically, it opens a bit of a window for us to take advantage, in my view, of the one thing that is essential for us to divert China from the path they're on, which is a confrontational path. And that diversion will only be effective if we can link with other free nations or other nations that just play by the rules of economic trade. If we can work together, collaboratively reach an approach to how we're going to deal with China, to have them understand what those rules will be and tell them, look, if you don't abide by these rules, then the consequences are going to be more painful for you, at least economically, than if you do abide by them. And that can't happen with just the U.S. speaking. If all that happens is the U.S. flexing our muscles get smaller and smaller relative to China's muscles as time goes on, if we're together with the rest of the world while we have dramatic impact.
Yeah, and it seems also, by the way, we don't necessarily have a great sense of what China's military capacity is, because a lot of times there's not great transparency about what China's doing in that regard. I understand that you've been involved in some efforts maybe to get us a better sense of how we might compare, for example, what we do with our military spending with what they do. Can you talk a little bit about some of those efforts?
Yeah, I'll just step back for a second and just note, China has made it very clear they want to become the military leader of the world, as well as the economic leader and the geopolitical leader. And they've made progress on all three. We don't see as clearly what's happening on the military front. We take enormous pride in the fact that we spend almost $1 trillion a year on military, if you include veterans benefits. And yet if you pierce how we spend that money, you find out that only about 15% is spent on procurement. And so then if you look at China and see how they're spending their money, and of course their cost of construction and personnel is much, much lower than ours, you find out that on a apples to apples basis, we're getting about the same procurement per year. So China is really arming in a way that's equivalent to the whole United States of America. And we, of course, have armament that's necessary to be deployed in missions around the world. They're focused on one region. If this keeps up very long, they're going to be the dominant military power in that region. And that's why you see the Philippines rethinking their military alliance with us. You see the Solomon Islands push off Taiwan. And I don't mean the Philippines are going to link with China. I just mean that the joint relationship we've had has been jeopardized by virtue of their latest understanding. So, China is a very significant military presence in the region and ultimately in the world, and we do not capture that. And you're right. I have added an amendment to this year's Defense Authorization Act, which would require our government to finally prepare an apples-to-apples comparison of their military procurement with our own.
You mentioned some of the challenges that China creates in its own neighborhood in the Indo-Pacific region with some of its neighbors. What does that say about what the United States needs to be doing in terms of our engagement in the region? And talk about both the military and diplomatic and economic dimensions of that.
You know, I think there was a time when America's lead was so dramatic, militarily, economically, geopolitically, that basically we said something and the whole world listened. And many people got in line because we said something. That's becoming harder and harder, not because we're weaker, but because the rest of the world has become stronger, particularly China, but other nations like South Korea. South Korea is now deemed to be the most technologically advanced nation in the world. So everyone doesn't jump just because America speaks. And what that means is for us to have the kind of power to dissuade nations from doing something that's not in the interest of America or interest of the world, we're best off if we're able to have close working relationships with other nations. And that means with our friends. It doesn't just mean with our enemies, it means getting closer to our friends. So in the region, of course, it means Australia, it means Japan, it means South Korea. I also believe it's important for us to have a good relationship with Taiwan. I mean, these are nations which collectively will, in my view, be able to help keep China from taking a course which continues to be excessively predatory.
So one of the things that China really has focused on in its sort of, in some ways, is looking inward and figuring out, particularly for Xi Jinping, how to consolidate more authority and power. One of the issues that's been in the headlines, particularly over these last several days, has been Hong Kong and what they've done with respect to passing a national security law for Hong Kong. How concerned should Americans be, Senator Romney, about what's happening in Hong Kong? And I guess why should it matter to a certain degree?
Well, what you're seeing in Hong Kong is outrageous as it relates to the people of Hong Kong, which are a freedom-loving, capable people. But it's also an indication of the direction that China is headed. What they have done, whether in Tibet or what they've done with the Uyghurs or what they do with Christian faiths in China, what they do in Hong Kong, all those things are related. And it's not going to stop with Hong Kong. They will continue their effort of pressure on their neighbors and ultimately perhaps subject them in one way or another. So we stand for Hong Kong, for the people there, but we also stand for other nations who will be next in line. And this is something where, again, we will be able to have the greatest impact if we speak with not just our voice, but with the voices of all the nations of the free world. And I say this because if only America objects, for instance, to the way that the people of Hong Kong are being treated, or the Uyghurs are being treated, well, then China is able to point and say, oh, this is just America. This is just that terrible country that doesn't know how to manage its own COVID. But if instead you have 50 or 100 nations come out and condemn what's being done to the Uyghurs or condemn what's happening in Hong Kong and do it on a collective basis, China, they care about their geopolitical future and they don't want to have the whole world against them.
Let's talk a bit about the economic relationship between the U.S. and China, because that obviously has been a focus of the last several years. In terms of what's coming next, we had this trade deal we did with China last year. There's been some conversation about whether the coronavirus pandemic has derailed the possibility of a future trade deal with China. Where do you think things stand in terms of our economic relationship with China? And do you think that another trade deal is the right answer?
I don't mind the trade deals. I don't mind an effort to have China buy more American products. But the real challenge that we have with regards to China's activity relates to their predatory business practices, basically not playing by the rules of fair trade around the world. And just to give one example, and that is predatory pricing, which is it's illegal in almost every developed country within a country for a company, for instance, to say, I'm going to go into a new area with my product and I'm going to price it substantially below cost and I'll subsidize that business or that area that I've gone into with the profits from my other businesses. And then when I've driven the competitors out of business, then we'll raise prices again. It's called predatory pricing. It's illegal under the Sherman Antitrust Act here. I know it's illegal almost to places all over the world. Well, China doesn't have a rule like that as it applies to competing outside China. And so they'll go into a marketplace with steel or stainless steel or commuter cars or semiconductors, you name it. They will go in. The government will subsidize on a massive basis that particular company or that particular industry until it's driven the competition out of business, at which point it raises prices and then takes a new area for its focus. And they're doing that time and time again. They will drive the most important high technology businesses of the future out of business, one after the other, until the world comes together and says, no, you can't do that. You've got to play by the same rules that we all play by, because markets can't work if we don't have people playing by the rules. I mean, I'm a free market guy, but if somebody's cheating, you don't have a free market anymore. So we have to make it very clear on a global basis that to have continued access to our markets on an unfettered basis, that China has to play by the rules. I believe they will if they're confronted on a global basis. But if it's just one country asking for to buy more soybeans, they'll say, sure, we'll buy some more soybeans, which they may or may not do, but they're going to go after our computers, our aircraft, our military hardware. I mean, they're going to go our communications technology, our pharmaceuticals, our artificial intelligence. They're going to go after each area, one after the other, driving the American businesses, Western businesses, free market businesses out of the marketplace and dominate the world economically. That's where they're headed. And we're all sitting back worried about whether they'll buy some more soybeans. Look, I love people buying more soybeans. The American farmer needs some help. But we got a bigger problem with China than that alone.
Do you think that we need to be more aggressive in, for example, moving supply chains for critical products back here to the U.S. so that we're not reliant on China? So people have talked about pharmaceuticals, personal protective equipment, particularly in the wake of this coronavirus pandemic. Do policymakers need to be a little bit more forward-leaning in that regard?
Well, I actually think that with regards to products that are essential to national security, that we should have a policy that we reach with our friends and neighbors of saying, look, we're only going to buy these products from free nations. And so when something like the communication systems are going to get upgraded to 5G, we say, look, we're not necessarily going to insist that 5G be made only by a U.S. company, but it's got to be made by a free nation. And we'll buy it from Nokia or from whomever, but it has to be made by a free nation, because we can't have products that are essential to our national security being made by a nation which has as its ambition the dominance of the world. And so that, in my opinion, is something that we're going to have to get to. But that's a small part, if you will, of the global trade and the global economy. And so I wouldn't look to bring everything back. We want America to be the most competitive. We wish everybody would bring everything here because we're most effective and most competitive. But with regards to national security elements critical to our national security, I think we ought to be buying those from free nations.
Do you think that, as you look ahead, do you think there is a huge or a large divergence in terms of how, for example, President Trump might deal with China in a second term versus, what we might see from the alternative, from Vice President Biden?
I haven't really heard either the current president or Joe Biden, former vice president, describe what their overall policy would be with regards to China. I don't know that it's great electoral politics to be talking about working together with other nations to work on a collaborative approach. I've proposed an amendment again to the Defense Authorization Act, which calls for nations of the Pacific to work with us to develop a strategy relating to China. These are things, are, I think, behind the scenes. They just happen to be critically important. I mean, of the great challenges America faces over the next several decades, without question, at the very top of this list, there are two or three things, and one of them is the emergence of China as a nation which seeks to put us in the rearview mirror, economically, militarily, and geopolitically. That's a very different world. And tariff policies, they may play a role, but only if they're linked with our friends around the world, so that China recognizes they can't keep playing the way they've been playing and get away with it. But if it's only us, well, there are a lot of other markets they can go to. and they will negotiate with us and they'll agree with us on various things, but it's not tough enough to get them to change their course unless we're the kind of leader that brings other nations of the world together and we confront China in a like manner, not to go to war with them, either economically or otherwise, but to dissuade them from taking a course which is so antithetical to the interests of the world.
So we have just a few minutes left, and I want to end with this question, which is, some characterize the relationship between the U.S. and China as entering a new Cold War. Do you accept that characterization of the relationship? And if you do, what do you think it would take to improve bilateral relations with China going forward?
I think the course we're on and the course China is on, which if continued at some length could ultimately lead to that kind of a posture, a hostile vision of one another, and nations refusing to trade with each other and basically opposing each other at every turn. I think that's where we're headed, more because of China's actions than ours. China's actions in Hong Kong, their actions at the South China Sea, what they're doing with the Uyghurs and other minorities and religious groups. I mean, these are really outrageous things. And as they continue along that course, I think it's going to be more and more difficult for us to pretend that they're a friend and a collaborating competitor. So what does it mean we got to do? Well, again, I go back to the same theme, which is we're going to have leaders in this country who are willing to sit down and do the hard work of saying, all right, what are the rules that we think are essential in dealing with China and getting them to take a different course than the course that they're on. And that's everything from each segment of our economy to our military preparedness, artificial intelligence, space technology. You take every aspect of this and say, what do we need to do? What are they doing? And then we have to look and say, okay, how do we build a coalition of nations around the world, which I think are anxious for us to do this? How do we build the kind of coalition that America has done time and time again? We built these coalitions in the past when we've had leaders here who are willing to do the hard work of putting that coalition together. I think we have to put that coalition together. Well,
there's no question, Senator, this issue is an important one. In fact, probably, as you noted, the important foreign policy issue for the years and decades to come. So thank you for sharing just a few of your thoughts on this very important issue.
Thanks, Lanhee. Good to be with you and our friends at the Aspen Institute.